So, my name is Christine O'Leary. I'm based in Sheffield Business School, and I've been working on assessment and assessment for learning in particular, probably forever. Well, at least as long as I've been in this institution. Right, and just to let you know what I'm going to cover today, I'm just going to give you a brief introduction, which is not going to be very dissimilar to the plenary that we had today in terms of the concepts and the ideas and the rationale for using this type of assessment. Then looking at aligning assessment with teaching and learning, basically the rationale. And I'm going to give you some examples from my own practice and my own subject groups. I haven't designed all of these examples, and not all of these are in use at the moment, because with the reduction, the interesting thing is with the reduction from to 2 tasks per 20 credits, some of these assessments have had to be moved to being formative completely, as opposed to assessments. But you've got some worked examples, and they've all been used in the past as formative as well as summative assessments, so they carried marks. But now some of them are actually just used as formative assessment because of that reduction. Okay, so moving on swiftly then, very similar to what we talked about this morning, a student-centered approach to assessment to promote learner engagement and motivation. It's important to consider that learners' interdependent and independent involvement in the learning increases motivation and develops their autonomy. The interesting thing, my research has been on assessment, but also on learner autonomy. And learner autonomy is very synonymous to self-regulation. Okay, so the concept of learner autonomy is students taking responsibility for their own learning, but not in isolation, in collaboration with others. And that helps them. So the concept of self-regulation is very similar to the concept of learner autonomy. And then looking at the alignment of assessment with learning and teaching practices, which is big. So learner engagement, they've got to be meaningfully engaged and be able to develop their own learning and environment. Students who are engaged can be identified for their sustained involvement in learning activities accompanied by positive emotions. So we need to design assessment that facilitate this approach. And if you think of the principles that we were presented for this morning, these are perfectly aligned. I mean, there's no... Right, and learner autonomy, as I say, fairly similar to self-regulation. Students able to take charge or responsibility for their own learning. So in order to do that, they need actually to develop not just their independence, but also the psychological and emotional capacity to control their own learning. So in a way, you need to design assessment processes and teaching and learning that enable the students to do that. And that's what actually we were talking about this morning in terms of the principles. So as part of the, if you like, the teaching and learning and the assessment process, they need to be able to develop their self-esteem, their understanding of what they need to do, and so on. Right, so looking at assessment for and as learning, and we've also again covered that this morning. Assessment is not just about measuring the learning, it's also helping the student develop their own learning. And we talk about assessment for learning, but there's also assessment as learning, where actually if you think of a consultancy project, the assessment is just, the learning is embedded in the assessment. The assessment is the only thing that the students do. So the assessment as learning, the assessment is the framework by which the students develop their own learning. So again, need to promote student engagement, so they need to be given the opportunity to initiate activities, and they need to be able to shape their learning environment. So that's where we're talking this morning about enabling the students to develop their own criteria, to be involved in the design as well as in the process of assessment. And I think that's something, there are a lot of examples at university level where the students are involved in the assessment. They have an input in their own assessment through self-assessment or peer feedback or peer assessment. What we're less good at, I think, at this university is actually involving the students in the design of the assessment. So involving them from the start. I think there are a few modules, very few now. There was one in education where the students actually designed their own assessment as part of the module learning outcome. And it's obvious because in education they will need to do that in the future. But I don't think there's any other modules now that actually do that at university level, although I know there were some in ACES in the past, but I don't think there are any now. I'm looking at Martin here.
Well, the requirement to have assessments before the beginning of teaching means that you can't do it.
Yeah, that's... Yeah, there are a number of constraints, and I was interested this morning to see on one of the cards that one of the recommendations of within those principles was to increase the number of assessment tasks. And of course we have gone in reverse, so we are limited. We've still got, let's be positive, we've still got actually little spaces, i.e. For instance, we can have formative assessment, which does give feedback to students over no marks. So, okay, so I'm just going to give you a few examples of these, and then I'd like, some discussion around these examples. So these are basically portfolio-based assessment, and what I'm giving you here is the university definition. What was agreed of portfolio-based assessment. So it's this university's interpretation of what portfolio-based assessment is. And it was one of the things that you could do in order to not get round, but operate within the constraints of a limited number of tasks, is that you can use one assessment task, which is essentially a portfolio. So that's the university definition. So it's you've got a single criterion grid, so everything is marked within one criterion grid, but the portfolio has got a number of assessment tasks, and these can be individual or group, and you can determine what these are in advance, obviously. And I've got some examples, worked examples here. Right, so if you think of that's an individual languages e-portfolio, that isn't one that I've personally designed. I'm looking at my colleague here. This is one that has been used in languages for a long time. So you can see here the what the students are being asked to do in terms of they've got to do 4 pieces of work. They have a planning record, a self-evaluation sheet, and then there's some choice in the way that they present their portfolio, so they can add summaries, analysis with diagrams, electronic versions of articles, and that's the beauty of having e-portfolios, obviously, because you can use a variety of medium. So what we were talking about this morning is part of giving students responsibility for their own learning is they've obviously got to have a framework and some guidance, but they've also got to have choice. Choice is an important part of what you actually offer students, because if they've no choice, if it's all prescribed, then they can't demonstrate either their independence or even interdependence if it's group work. So choice is, And then the idea of self-evaluation or reflection. That's an important part, as we saw in the principle this morning, so that they can look at they need to have some opportunity to evaluate their progress or the progress of others. Right, and this is a languages portfolio, but what's interesting is you can see the variety of activities that the students might engage with. And obviously this is particular to the development of language specialism and language generally, foreign language generally. But obviously you can see that you've got a variety of medium that they can use and upload onto their portfolios. And then the criterion grid. I don't know if you can see that very well, but you can see that the criterion, there's one criterion grid. You've got content, it's important. So the criterion grid does actually give them guidance as to what a good portfolio might look like under the different bands. And then what's important there is that the planning, organisation and presentation are included. So if you want the students to demonstrate self-regulation, managing their own learning, then you have to have that assessed. So you're assessing the process as well as the output within this portfolio, and that's an important part of it. And the weighting that you give to the outputs very much to the output versus process depends on your learning outcomes, essentially. Right, and the second one is really, this has moved really to formative. This is the portfolios that I did my research in a long time ago, and it was developed over the years. But when we moved to assessment tasks per 20 credit modules, then this became formative. We are still using a portfolio for the specialist student doing translation and interpreting. But actually for the specialist students, we've still got the portfolio, which is an individual portfolio. But for the translation and interpreting students, the specialist language students, we actually move that to a formative task because they've got other aspects that they need to develop, and we were over the task limit really. So, but this is an example. I've chosen this because this is an example where you've got a mixture of group task and individual task. And they have obviously got free choice as part of that as well. And there is also a reflection piece at the end. And this has worked really well, but in terms also of developing their, and we still use it in a formative sense, developing their capacity for not just self-reflection, but giving peer feedback to the other students. And also, what it's enabled them to do is, when they do a group translation, they get together and they actually do the translation separately, then get together to get the best translation, and they give each other feedback. And I noticed the first time I ever did that sort of exercise, how much improved the weaker students were because they'd had a lot of feedback from their peers, and they'd also been able to develop their understanding of what translation was. From their peers. At the January assessment exchange, I presented some of the research based on that. But if anybody is interested, I can let you have the papers. Right, and the marking grid is simple for that. It's looking at performance, and the important thing is also looking at progression. So what the portfolio encourages the students to do is act on feedback, tutor feedback and peer feedback. In the group translation, obviously they act on peer feedback and tutor feedback to produce a final version. So the progression is also considered. And again, planning and reflection. So you can see that this ties in with what we were looking at this morning. So part of it is not just about performance, i.e. the output. It's also about self-regulation, which is planning and reflection, and the one before, which is progression. So how do the students engage with feedback? And of course, if you're giving it marks, you're encouraging the students to go through the process. They still go through the process if you use that purely formatively, but you don't get the same standard of work, or at least I haven't, the same standard of engagement by some students. Okay. But the interesting thing that I noticed over the years is that the portfolio within those modules had different weighting, because you used to have a portfolio, then two outputs, a translation and an interpreting task. And sometimes the portfolio was just worth 20, but over the years, over about 10, 12 years, the portfolio was worth 20%. The portfolio has been worth 40% and 70%. But it didn't matter what percentage you gave it. The quality of the student work was the same. They engaged as much with a portfolio that was worth 20% as they did with a portfolio that was worth 70%. That was the interesting thing, that it seemed to be a small amount of mark could get them hooked. And but obviously, whilst if they do it in a purely formative sense, then some students don't engage as well. The very instrumental students will do less or will not engage as much. Right, and the last one. This is in use now. It was developed 2 years ago in conjunction with another colleague, and it's a consultancy project. So the students actually go out to companies and do some consultancy projects for the companies. So that the nature of the project is determined by the company. So we, for instance, have students looking at developing, marketing a product in different countries in Europe. We've had students looking at website translations and the best way to do that. And they work in groups, and obviously there's company involvement. And you can see that the actual portfolio has a mixture of group and individual work. So they've got a planning record, they've got a group project plan, and then they've got a group report to write, but they've also got some individual, so group presentation. They've also got some individual work that they have to do there. And then they have a reflective piece in English, and then a critical reflection about personal and team performance. So you see, that is a mixed, and essentially that's assessment as learning, because that's all they do. They are guided, but the framework for the learning process is actually the portfolio. And that has been very, very successful. We're getting more and more groups, but that's been extremely successful in terms of the student performance. And these are the criteria. obviously here you've got the performance of the performance. And what's important to say is that we, in the criteria itself, I don't know if you can see it very well, but we have mentioned that in this band, that although the tasks are completed to a satisfactory standard, although the group report may be of a higher standard due to contribution from the other members of the group. So we have specified that the group report must be much better than the student performance. But obviously, because it is a group report, the student, the group report might be a first, but the student might still achieve a 2-2 category because of their own contribution. Right, and obviously intercultural awareness is one of the learning outcomes, so we're looking out for that. And planning and reflection, again, that's an important part. The last one is on the handouts, and that's quite a different type of assessment. That's student-led seminar. So that's moving away from portfolios, and basically what we ask the students to do, and now that is now a formative assessment as opposed to a summative assessment, again because we have too many tasks. But if you look at the back, so you've got basically what a group does is they design a seminar for their peers. We use those as exam revision. So essentially they take a topic that we've covered through the year, do extra research for it, design activities, and then present their research or their slant of the topic to the rest of the class and run the seminar. Now they're 2-hour seminars, and at first we used to say, you do 1 hour and we'll do the rest. But actually, it's very rare that we have to intervene at all. It's usually the 2 hours, and we just participate. So we'll go in a group, we'll answer questions, but what has struck me over the years is their technological ability. I've always said to them, I am glad these are the last seminars because you put me to shame. And that, they've had all sorts of ideas for activities. We had university challenge as part of, to answer the questions. Really, really creative and very, very able technologically in the main. And that seems to have, particularly where we used to have exam revisions, where students were really switched off. I did a lot of work, but they didn't do anything. And they didn't engage with anything very much either, or didn't attend these revision sessions. That made a big difference. And then you post all of the material from the student-led seminars onto the Blackboard Learning, so everybody's got access to them when they come to revising for their exams. But what's important here is that we do tell the students, we do give some guidance to the students, if you like, handing over some of the teaching tools to them. So we have some discussions around there. And at the back, you've also got the grid as to which, showing how these were marked when they're actually had some summative marks attached to them. So again, you've got, the presentation, the content, the quality of language, and a reflective report. The students used to reflect on their performance in that as well. So nearly out of time. I've just said anything, but I mean, any comments, questions?
I work with Christine on this module, but there's one thing I say as well, the advantage of the portfolios, you can help the student on an individual basis, on a formative basis, so they'll all have different problem areas that they'll need individual help with, and I think the portfolio really helps to hone those skills that they're still learning.
Yeah, because you've got, obviously we give feedback on a regular basis, so it's not an end point. So where it's marked right at the end, you still give feedback on an individual basis.
Christine, this is probably a trigger for a follow-up conversation. I'm interested that you're assessing intercultural skills. You are, aren't you?
Yeah, that's
yeah.
right.
I'd be interested to find out more about that, because that's where I'm keen with my international role in the sport department. I'm keen that we move into that territory.
Right.
But I don't underestimate the challenge, so it'd be useful to pick your brains on that.
Absolutely.
And the sports students are working with a new module which is aligning their core specialism and the language and the culture.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't understand that.
I'm already developing this with your colleagues.
Are you?
Yes.
Okay, useful to know.
We have, yes,
Right.
what we've got is in the languages. We've developed a module which has the language skills, but attached to the language is a research project.
Excellent.
Which is looking at the intercultural
Wonderful. Follow up on that. Thank you.
capacity. Anything else? Any? I mean, how many of you do use this sort of assessment? Portfolios as well?
Well, because we have it's not an issue of rigour per se, but there is an issue with getting students to demonstrate, because I teach in law,
Yeah.
getting students to demonstrate legal research skills that are very doctrinal, so still in their third year when we would use portfolio assessments a bit more, getting them to demonstrate familiarity with legal sources alongside some of the group working and intercultural and reflective skills that your assessment clearly does draw on.
Yeah.
So we have had a tendency to use research case study write-ups as well. So my students will work on a project, they're working groups just like yours have done, but while they produce a 2,500 word portfolio, excluding appendices as yours has done in one of these examples, we would have a sort of matching 2,000 word research piece as well. So our portfolio-based modules have been accused sometimes of being a bit over-heavy in assessment. But we've got this fear in law of being the law school that lacks rigour. You know, it's the thing that you don't want to get a reputation for. But some of my colleagues are moving towards, because as you were saying, reducing the number of assessments, it's seen in the third year that these employability links, you know, some of the points you're making, they're more important than some of the research skills that students apparently have already developed by the third year. So it's the case study bits that are going, it's the research-based bits of those modules that go when we bring the assessment down, because we wouldn't want to lose these portfolio-based assessments. So I agree with many of the things that you've outlined. We use them ourselves.
And I mean, one of the keys is convincing the students.
Is it okay?
Yeah,
We're going to
we just need, we probably need to end. One of the keys is convincing the students that actually they're learning as part of doing the assessment. And the portfolio may be time consuming, but actually they're doing the learning as they go along. And that is the key really. Right, I must stand here. Thank you very much, and apology for all these technical difficulties I'm making. Thank you. So, but if you're interested in any of the research or anything like that, just do contact me. As I say, I presented the research at the last assessment exchange.
It's interesting, you picked up exactly the same bullet point as I did.
Yes.
And we know why.